Dr. Barkadar and Amelia are here to discuss that. Amelia is a part of an amazing company. She owns an amazing company, TBI Analytics, and she has like over 20 years experience in the med legal field, working in all different aspects of the med legal field, but primarily diagnostics. And Dr. Barkadar is here to offer his medical opinion to what we are finding as trends and tips and all of that stuff when it comes to diagnostics for med legal cases. So I will get the slides started for Dr. Barkadar so he can kind of go into what is available for diagnostics, whether it's imaging, testing, things like that, and then Amelia will deep dive into the differences of them.
Okay, awesome. So CT, CAT scans. So what are CAT scans? We know they're imaging. CAT scans are done in the ER, for head injuries, almost all the time now, unless they really unless they don't think that there's a head injury at all. But CAT scans are done because they're fast. They're good for that low Glasgow-Coma scale. They need to know if there's an immediate bleed, if their person needs to have their head cut open. That's what CAT scans are good for. Bleeds, fractures, immediate emergency things. Once the ER does their CAT scan, if that CAT scan doesn't show something dangerous, what is the ER usually doing? They're just sending the patient home. Even if there's a brain injury, even if there's going to be a lot of other abnormalities, they're kind of like, well, you're not going to die today, so you're going to be shipped off. That's what the CAT scan is really good for. Obviously, a CAT scan is like you're not going to see minor damage. You're not even going to see. I would look at it as like a CAT scan is kind of like a painting from a distance, and an MRI is a little bit more of like a photograph. MRI can see more subtle disease. The age of bleeding on an MRI up to a certain point can be determined. Once you get like a couple months out, you can't tell anything anymore how old things are. But in the first days, weeks, you can kind of, if you have a good neuroradiologist, figure out how old something is too. So these are the one on the left, the A is a CAT scan, and then B and C are a certain sequence of an MRI. I think that's an SWI or on the middle, and then maybe a T2 FLAIR on the right. But in any case, that CAT scan on the left looks normal, and you can see how blurry it is. It looks kind of like visual snow on your TV. But you kind of see on the B, those two big black dots, that's bleed. Yeah, and then on the right, that's also it looks like an enhanced, maybe like a diffusion imaging. So that's an acute lesion over there. So the MRIs are picking up these small things that the CAT scans just never will. This is probably too dense for us. We can skip it. So not all MRIs are created equal. I'm sure Amelia's going to go into a lot of detail about this. When they say Tesla, it's like 3 Tesla, 1.5 Tesla. We're not talking about Elon Musk. We're talking about MRIs. Tesla is the strength of the magnet, how strong it is. The higher the number, the better the magnet. The better the magnet, the clearer your image. So we're going to go into some details on that. Amelia will go into it, and I will as well. So here's on the left, we have a 3 Tesla, bigger number, better magnet. On the right, we have a 1.5 Tesla. So I'm going to kind of stand up, if that's okay. So we'll go with the 1.5 Tesla. We do kind of see one lesion up here. It's that little faint white dot. The CAT scan, of course, would miss that entirely. When we go down to our 3, we see that little white dot is way more pronounced, way more obvious, and we also found another lesion here. So I'm not sure if you can tell that, but the 1.5 just didn't pick it up. That would have been just totally missed. In an MRI, and imagine in mild traumatic brain injury where already they're being read normal, you really, when you have the finding and you can show it and point the finger, you really want it. So there is a big difference between the types of MRIs. This is just some more examples of 1.5s and 3s. The 1.5s aren't really showing some of these lesions by the arrows. This is probably too anatomical. We can probably skip that also. Different types of signals. So when the neuroradiologist, or even I look at the imaging, the neurologist, when we look at things, there's different sequences. So when you go to an MRI, there's a bunch of different types of these MRIs that happen. Some of them look for blood. Some of them look for strokes. Some of them are better at looking for injuries. Some of them look just at the anatomy. And so a lot of times when I put in my order, I'm going to say, hey, like I want a 3 Tesla, and I want it with an SWI, and I want it with a DTI. And all these fancy words is because without these sequences, you can kind of miss some of the subtle disease. Susceptibility, that's just one of the best ways to look at bleeding. GRE was kind of like a little bit of the older version. Now we have something called SWI, which is susceptibility weighted, just fancy words for we see a nice big black spot when there's blood. We see the CAT scan, doesn't really show the bleed, didn't show this tiny bleed. CAT scans are great for bleeds, but it just kind of didn't show it or didn't show that lesion. And then these are the different sequences. So this is what I mean by different types of MRIs. So this is all the same person. This is all the same MRI, but just different sequences. So different things that the MRI looked at. And so we see on the left looks normal. Then on the T2, if you're not really trained, it looks kind of like it's normal. But then when you go to the FLAIR, those white matter lesions that we always talk about, this is like one of those white matter lesions. But even that, you kind of have some white other spots. It doesn't pop out at you. But when we look down to the susceptibility weighted, this is all blood. So missed on all the other sequences. So if you went to the MRI center and they didn't get the right sequences, you're getting a normal MRI for somebody who has got bleeding in their head, or had bleeding in their head. I'll point that out. If you guys said, if I get an MRI result and I see they didn't do it, I'm going to, of course, say, oh, this was not the right test. This is kind of like some fancier imaging. These are CAT scans on the top. That's a huge bleed. On the bottom, it's something called perfusion. You guys will almost never see that, so we can probably just skip it. DTI, I know Amelia is going to go into this as well. Diffusion tensor imaging. So nerves, I like to think of them as like wires or hoses. They come and happen in tracts, and they function with a certain amount of like efficiency, or how they kind of transmit the information is like a layman's way of thinking about it. And the way that I think about it is I think it is just like a bunch of like a garden hose maybe, and there's water being pumped through there, and that water is the information. You can have one that's fully intact, and then you can have one that's full of holes and it's been damaged. The one full of holes might still work, but you're going to get it really leaky. It's going to be really leaky. The information is going to be slower. It's not going to be as good or efficient. DTI kind of looks at those nerve tracts and is looking at how efficient those nerve tracts are. Are they like the normal population should be, or are they not as functional? FA values is probably the most important value in DTI. That kind of is a number that we put for that leakiness of the vessels. Those are some pictures. I think Amelia will have nicer ones. I think she'll have nicer ones. Other diagnostics, are we talking about other diagnostics as well? I spoke about them a lot. So our VNGs are vestibulonostogram, looks for dizziness and imbalance, central or peripheral. So people who complain about dizziness, balance, sometimes they can't even explain it, I just don't feel stable. Our VNG is a test that, I don't think it's fun to do, especially in people who have dizziness, but it moves them around, looks at their eyes, looks at their ears with a whole host of testing, and then you kind of say that there is a problem in the brain that affects balance, either peripherally, that means more like inner ear, or centrally, the brain itself.
And the good thing about it is that it is a totally objective test. So if somebody has a vestibular problem, it will find it, and there's no control the person has over their ability to manipulate test results, say like in answering questionnaires or something like that.
Yeah, so sometimes on our exam when we have dizziness, we're going to be looking at their eyes with our eyes also. We're going to be looking for some of the things physically, like sometimes we can see the nystagmus, which is you might see that word nystagmus, eyes are just beating, they look to the right, then it goes just starts beating. Sometimes it's so severe we can see it, but the VNG is a device that can pick up on more subtleties. Our EEGs are electroencephalogram. It's kind of like the EKG, but we put the leads on the head. Brain waves are much smaller than like heart waves, and so it's like a little bit more sensitive. Everybody has brain waves, and brain waves, there's ones that look normal and there are ones that look not normal. Just like, so I get a lot of things that I get about the EEGs, like, oh, they're frequently normal. You have to think of it like your MRI. In your mild TBI, you're going to get a lot of these normal results, but in a lot of these patients, if you find your brain waves are slow in one area, or you start seeing seizure activity or spikes, that's like a real clinching thing for you. And it's really easy on the patient. We put some leads on, and we can see those waves. So I think it's just like in other things in mild TBI, we don't always get a positive response, but when we do, it's quite important. EKG, I guess an EKG we can use, but less important for me. Nerve conduction study tests. So nerve conduction study tests are less to do with brain injuries and more to do with peripheral nerve injuries, because we're neurologists, we check all the nerves. So your neck injuries and your back injuries that have radiating pain into the arms and legs, we're going to do our nerve studies, and we can kind of evaluate for damage. That being said, just a little touch on, you could have normal nerve studies and still have radiculopathy or pinched nerves, because they don't do a great job on the sensory nerves, and some of those nerves are past the point where the test can lead. So kind of like an adjunct, just because we see so much of brain injury along with spine injury. When you send to the neurologist, oftentimes we will say, hey, this guy looks like he has a nerve injury too. Would you like us to further evaluate, or we might make those recommendations on our own.
A couple other diagnostics that I've seen be used on TBI cases have been either Oculogica or iBox, where it will track the eye movement to determine, how the eyes are responding or how the eyes and the brain are working together. They've gotten popular. Also, functional capacity evaluations have been used to determine kind of like how the brain and the body are working together. These are all different things that you guys can use depending, the case, what is necessary, what the problems are, but your neurologist will probably help direct some of those testing.
Yeah, so that's like a big part of what we're going to do is quarterback that. We're going to have the person come in, we're going to go through all of the TBI symptoms that you guys are meant to memorize, but maybe sometimes it's hard, and then we're going to set them up with the right diagnostics, at least make the appropriate recommendations for you. And then if you guys have a question, is do we really need this? Or the patient's claustrophobic, or they're really afraid of the test, we'll have a conversation. Yes?
Quick question. What are your thoughts on QEEG?
Yeah, so QEEG, I think that there is value in it. I personally don't do the QEEGs myself, but I think there is value. I think there's some good studies behind them. They're more, for sure, a lot more information, and I think sometimes categorizing them into the right places is a little bit tricky. But there is value in them.
So this slide is about, back in 2018, I was working with Richard right here, the company he's with, HMR Funding. And this is when my vendor experience became more of a expert type side of things, where when I was working with them, they wanted to fund more TBI cases. But in order to prove these TBI cases and to put the money into them, we got to get the objective evidence for these attorneys, right? So that's their risk going into these cases. If they've got to put their non-recourse money on it, well, we better be sure that we have a TBI case that we're putting our money on. So I was working with a well-known attorney, Alejandro Blanco, who is well-known as far as trying cases all throughout the country, and actually speaks on how to do that with attorneys. And so he brought this case before federal court, of all things, a neurologist, a female neurologist at 55 years old, slipped and fell on a Carnival cruise line. And obviously defense is saying that's not true, she doesn't have a TBI. So he wanted to use diffusion tensor imaging, advanced software, not just the diffusion tensor software that you could find at your local MRI center. This is calibrated software that has the measurements that are based on a normative database that we can actually have objective evidence. Because if you don't have quantitative, now you're still dependent on your expert. We want to have software that has quantitative measurements, that it is looked at a normative database, so that we are comparing these. So he was able to get it through federal court. It was passed, Daubert challenge met, and here we are. We're off to the races now. This is now being entered into the PI court system, and more judges out there are accepting it as evidence. So I put the smoking gun on there, because as a helper with the HMR funding, I'm thinking, well, there's so many attorneys out there that need this type of evidence. How many others out there? So I then got really involved in diagnostics and this type of imaging. So, we're seeing a lot of these cases, they go in, they get the MRI even, or sometimes the CT scan, and they're coming out normal. And this is happening all over the place. As you see, 80% of these TBI cases are mild. And if you're just using brain standard MRIs, you're not going to pick it up, just like Doctor showed you. So here we are, we're back at normal, and it's very frustrating because then now these patients are going down the wrong road. They're not getting the treatment that they deserve, and they're left stranded, and their family's thinking they're crazy, they think they're crazy. It's just a sad thing. And then your case managers or attorneys are left held with, well, now how do we prove that this person has some kind of TBI? We've got to go the clinical route. So research and science has shed light that diffusion tensor imaging is helping to show where the damage is in the axonal area of the brain. So I love this picture because it's truly what our fiber tracks are doing. We've got trillions of them, right? So they're going every which way. And I liked his layman's analogy of how to think about it. I tell people, I think about it like a power cord. You've got this myelin sheath, which is your material protecting all of these cords in, those different cords that are in there. And if this cuts open, right, now we've got shearing involved with those wires, and now we're not making a good connection to this computer. I always do it with my phone in the car. Do you ever do that where you're pulling that enough times and now it's shredding and you don't get quite that connection and that power? You're like putting it just right. Well, that's what's going on in the brain. When axonal shearing is happening, these fiber tracts are splitting open with that myelin sheath. It's entering now hemosiderin into the brain. You've got toxicity going on. Now you got the white matter lesions forming. Now you've got separation of connecting fiber tracts, not making a connection anymore, whether that's behavior, motor, cognitive, what is it? So how do we see it? We got to look at where the axonal shearing is, and your standard brain MRI is not measuring this. So then you can use even a 7.0 Tesla magnet. You can get it as high as you want as far as a magnet goes. But unless you're going into the actual science in the brain, you're not going to superimpose anything. You've got to actually get the actual data collected, the right sequences. So the other thing I learned is that not all diffusion tensor imaging is the same. So if one imaging center is saying, we can do MRI, DTI, I would challenge them and say, where is your normative database coming from? What's the software you're using? Who's the neuroradiologist providing the report? Many times I'm seeing that they're missing things because now we're dependent on the expert to look at the imaging and making their own opinion instead of depending on AI, instead of depending on quantitative data. So we gotta look at all the sequences, right? So we touched on this, the different ones, and which each one does. I've worked on probably almost 500 cases in the last 5 years with traumatic brain injury. And I will tell you, most of the time, providers out there, thank God for Dr. Barcador here, but most providers don't understand that there is other sequences out there to collect the data on the brain. So when you're doing the FLAIR and you're getting those white matter, we can actually do it. There's software out there that you can actually do the whole protocol, all these sequences in one shot in 30 minutes. You're getting somebody on that machine and you're getting it all. Don't send this person back for more imaging, because the last thing that a TBI patient wants to do is get on an MRI. We're already claustrophobic. Now you want to put us on an MRI that, we're already got stuff going on. Now you want to tell them, oh, sorry, we need to get another sequence collected on you? Are you kidding me? It's not going to happen. So save yourself the trouble. If your policy warrants it, it's the best interest of your client to get the best imaging. All right, so that's what I always say. Let's look at that policy. Let's see if there's enough to get the best. If there isn't, then let's go down this road, right? There's different tiers on how we approach and triage these. So now there's technology out there where, this hadn't been heard of in 10 years or prior, simply because it's all been research-based science, right? You have to go through research to get it up the levels and now be entered into the court system. So now that we have more out there being talked about, more providers are seeing it more More cases are getting settled because of it. Now we're seeing up in the ranks coming up in this is more advanced technology that's now being able to identify the microbleeds being trauma versus calcification or old age or some other way of that bleed getting in the brain. It's possible, and that's defense every time. Well, they're getting older or what have you, right? That's a bleed because of this. We now have technology out there that another layer in the same imaging is able to warrant that this is from trauma. And if there is one microbleed from trauma, then there's probably 100 more that I've heard my neuroradiologists telling other attorneys this. So if you're missing that microbleed technique, it's really, and not every case has microbleeds. I've seen many that have just the axonal shearing. And that's why you want to do the differential diagnosis, because if you don't have it in one, you may have it in the other technique. But if you don't do them all, how are you going to know? So it really leaves stuff on the table if you're not doing the whole protocol with all these different techniques out there. And I know that's just not something everybody knows. Volumetrics, it measures the atrophy of the brain, or is it expanding because of swelling? If you're not doing that, how are you going to know if this person is swelling because of trauma versus, or shrinking because of old age or what have you? So these are the things that I've just seen from my view and my lens, and just there's a lot out there that can really confuse the whole thing. And so I just like to clarify, and if you ever have any questions, I'm happy to help with the experience that I have. And that's really what I had to say.
Dr. Barkadar, when do you think that you're typically ordering imaging on a
question.
Case?
Yes, so if there is a clinical diagnosis of a traumatic brain injury, I'm going to order an MRI of the brain unless there's a contraindication like a pacemaker that's not compatible. But almost always I'm going to get an MRI of the brain. I always want a 3 Tesla. Sometimes, things are not always possible. Sometimes patients are claustrophobic. Sometimes they have other contraindications. But that's the ideal situation. The ideal situation is, I think, in a traumatic brain injury patient, they should have an MRI of the brain. Mm-hmm. So just about always.
I can answer that as well. With the neuroradiologists that I have worked with, most of them will tell you the acute phase is between the first day and 6 months. So anything, prior to the 6 months, yes, you can get it, but over time, the hemosiderin sits in, you can actually capture more of the progression of what's going on. But if you want to get a baseline, absolutely, it's going to show something. But I've heard my neuroradiologist say it's safe to wait 3 months just to give the brain something to go back to, because we don't know how they're going to react. Some brains actually, their neuroplasticity comes right back and we're good. But after 3 months, if you're still talking to that client of yours and they're still having symptoms, that's when we typically say, let's get an MRI done on them and see what's going on.
Richard.
Because the timing is right, I want to ask y'all a question. Both of y'all speak on brain shearing a little bit for everybody.
Brain shearing? Well, yeah, the axonal shearing that happens, you don't have to have your brain, you don't have to have a strong impact on your brain in order to have axonal shearing, right? So when you have that acceleration, deceleration injury, that's when axonal shearing I see happening most of the time on these cases. Typically when you're just blunt force trauma, you're not getting that axonal shearing happening. You're getting more microbleeds that's happening. So it depends really on that injury, which you're probably going to see. But axonal shearing, there's so much that goes on in that. I think I explained it with when you can actually have those fiber tracts separate, so there's no more connection there. And then it's not asymmetry in the brain. So if you have in the left brain some axonal shearing happening and it's not happening in the right brain and they got hit on that left side, well, guess what? Or their head went back and forth like that lobe of the brain is probably going to have some injury there. And so then if we clinically correlate it with the neuropsych or neurologist's evaluation, we can then make the correlation. And that's what I've seen on the cases I work on. If you have your objective imaging and your clinical correlation, you've got a 1-2 punch that defense can't argue with. And what's cool about this advanced imaging to show this axonal shearing, you're going to show the asymmetry in the brain. And with anything else, it should be symmetrical. So that's a huge component of axonal shearing. If you can show that, and not every case is going to have axonal shearing either. So that's what, it's a beautiful thing when you can show it.
Dr. Barger, what's your axonal shearing opinion?
Yeah. So what is axonal shearing? Axon is like the nerve tract, and shearing is like it gets twisted or pulled or pushed, and that usually happens from rapid acceleration deceleration. But also a strong enough impact is also causing rapid acceleration deceleration. And so she kind of made it a point, and we made it before. But essentially, your brain sits in your skull. So out here, this is all skull, and then this is your brain here. And then there is a spinal fluid around there. Your brain is kind of like sitting in this fluid. So when you have an impact or acceleration, deceleration, this is your skull, this is your brain, you're moving, all of a sudden this stops, your brain keeps going, boom, impact. Then it bounces back against the back of the skull, boom, impact, or side to side. So that's to make the statement that you don't need an actual impact. That's acceleration, deceleration. And then you just have to imagine the brain is these bundles of nerves and tracts, and these things will twist and tear and burn. And so that's what shearing is. And so when that happens, they can be little tiny bleeds. There can be axonal damage. Those can show up as gliosis with white matter changes. And that's really what it is.
What's the onset of that, would you say?
Oh, I mean, the shearing happens right away, right? So you have the primary injury with the shearing, and then you have the secondary injury. So so maybe you'll tear some vessels, maybe there'll be some blood starting to appear. You'll start getting the chemicals coming in there. You'll get swelling, and sometimes that'll be visible. For instance, if there's a good amount of it, even the CAT scan might show the swelling or the bleeding. CAT scans can pick up bleeds, maybe not the tiniest ones, but if they get big enough. But then what happens to a bleed afterwards is your body, starts to heal, the bleeding stops or get resorbed, but blood has iron in it. And that iron deposits, they stay there, sometimes forever. And so these sequences, some of what they're picking up is that leftover iron. And so I think those were some of the statements that it might be better to wait a few months because we'll get a little bit more. I kind of think of it as, I also want to know right now what's going on. Exactly. But certainly waiting can give you a little bit more information. But I think clinically I'm like, oh, the patient is right here. But in any case, yeah. So that iron is deposited there, and those really can light up on an MRI in those SWI sequences. And you see like a nice black dot in a white background, so it becomes really, really obvious in those microbleeds if they're big enough. So. In terms of timing and how that process happens, you have the initial impact. Within seconds, minutes, hours, you're getting the chemicals released. You're getting swelling probably pretty right away, and then you're getting healing. Now that could all be microscopic and we can not see it, or that can be as big as the swelling is so big that the brain now gets squished and the person passes away. Hopefully not, but it can be. That's the spectrum, microscopic to visibly killing the person.
I forgot to mention as well that there is a difference between the thickness of these MRIs. Many go 2 to 5 millimeter slices, right? Every 2 to. So these microbleeds are 1 millimeter or less. They're nano, So if you're taking these slices every 2 to 5, you're missing those milliliter microbleeds, right? So there's technology out there that I have access to that takes it at 1 millimeter. They are calibrating that MRI to making sure they are taking slices at every millimeter. So we're capturing way more data. And I know that's definitely one of the things I wanted to say that came up. Also in these almost 500 cases that I've personally worked on, all of these cases come up with the symptomatology. We will not scan a patient without head documentation. If we don't see that there's symptoms here of TBI, we're not going to scan a patient. We're not going to do that to them. So I will tell you that having those intake sheets, having those conversations with the client every few months to see how they're doing is very relevant in these cases, because that documentation they do depend on that. Providers do. And it's just even that simple intake sheet. I send that off to an MD and they write an order over a telehealth call with the client, right? So then that's what gets the ball rolling. And I will tell you, I probably have a handful of cases after 448 that come back without any real findings. I'm not kidding. These cases are settling like you wouldn't believe because they're actually getting the quantitative data. Done. We can show it, and then we got him to clinically correlate. We got Ponton to clinically correlate. That's the gist of the whole thing. I've seen it time and time again. I have the experience to actually speak about it. So anything else? Yes?
Good question. So let's say that we have all these pretty pictures and all this amazing technology, but the report comes back and says, gives you a very broad strokes about what the findings mean. So what makes a difference is the interpretation, and I wonder if you can speak to that.
Absolutely.
Like you're a radiologist, and what kind of specialized training they have to read this and so on.
So I think when we're dealing with imaging in general, like when you have a case, I think also asking for the images is alongside the report and making sure, like Amelia was saying, having the clinical correlation just with any imaging, because I can't tell you how many images I've seen on brain injury cases where they barely put 2 sentences on the neuroradiological report. So I think that is definitely like the first thing. I know Amelia, TBI Analytics, there's reporting for different types of imaging that is much more in depth, but if we're talking just across the board imaging and how to deal with these like very broad strokes or very vague reports, that's I think the first line of defense, so to speak. Like make sure you get it in front of somebody that can take a look at the actual images, and start asking questions. Not to mention that I have seen so many erroneous neuroradiological reports come through that aren't even necessarily reading the right report, or there's been a lot of errors too. So that is definitely a point to take note of, just with imaging across the board.
Yes, that's one of the main things that I've seen in these years of working behind brain injury is the interpretation. If that radiologist does not understand TBI in a way for personal injury, it can actually, put the case on a whole different path. But the important thing is I've always been in that view for the plaintiff, because I'm not an attorney, I'm not a doctor. I always came from that place, like if I was in that person's shoes, what would I do? What would I want to do, right? Who would I want to hire? What software would I want on my brain? So I'm constantly doing that. And the neuroradiologists that I have worked with are brilliant. And I've been fortunate to work with neuroradiologists that know what they're doing in this space. So I've been trained well by these guys, and now know what to look for. But yes, I have seen them out there that it's just these reports come back so vague, they're misinterpreted, and that's the biggest pitfall, in my opinion, of TBI. Really. So I only work with neuroradiologists that understand TBI and the PI situation. So you can hire them as an expert, go defend the findings in court, and all that kind of stuff. So the reports are stellar. Anybody?
Yes.
You indicated like you get machinery that can get like slices of 1 millimeter besides the T3. Is there?
There are 7.0 magnets out there, but you're not going to see them in a setting for PI. They're going to be at UCLA or USC or something like that. But 3 Tesla is really all you need for this type of imaging. And that's pretty known now out there. Now, you have to ask if they have the DTI capabilities on there. Not every 3T magnet has the ability to run this type of software on there. So that was the crux of what I did for the last 5 years, is just researching imaging centers. I will call them up and say, do you have DTI capabilities? They're going, what's that? I don't even know what that is. Most of them will not know what that is. I'm actually training imaging centers to put this on their magnets so that they can get more income, coming their way. I'm actually training imaging centers about protocols. It's crazy. So, but that's just where we're at. This is research technology that is now hitting the forefront of this space, and it's exciting times. These are great times to be trying some TBI cases. Absolutely.
Any other questions?
you elaborate on the findings of the DTI MRIs? Like what are the difference more about what are the differences between technologies?
So really, when I say quantitative, it means that we pulling from a normative database that they have done age gender match. So like, a female, age 30, and even down to ethnicity. We can actually determine what would somebody in a normal setting be versus what they're doing now. It's the deviations between the two. We have it down to a science, and the AI picks that up. So it's all quantitative. So there's no human error, if you will, now. I know there's clinical correlation that definitely has to be made, but the neuroradiologist can actually sit there and say, these are findings of of traumatic brain injury. He doesn't say mild. He doesn't just say, that's the clinical part. He will say, these are findings that relate to traumatic brain injury. And it will be right in that report, permanent traumatic brain injury, in fact. And then he'll say, clinically correlate, recommendations are to clinically correlate this. But he is saying in his objective findings that this is a traumatic brain injury. So quantitatively, you just have to know that if it goes into litigation, that we have the software, the backing, the science to prove it.
So if you have the DTI MRI done by one center, you be able to run it against on both AI machines to see if there is a difference between either interpreted or not?
So in order to collect this certain protocol sequence, it has to be collected from that MRI, right? So that's why not all DTIs are one and the same. So you have to rescan that patient with our protocol. You would have to, unless, no, I don't even want to say unless, because that MRI probably wasn't scanning at every millimeter, so they're not going to capture that. So if they compare it to what we're doing, it's just not going to add up. That's why we have to calibrate these MRIs to the specific protocol in order for the quantitative measurement to be there. All the MRIs out there that boast that they have DTI do not have a quantitative measurement behind it. It's their subjective interpretation. It's just an anatomical, this is what you got, this is your interpretation. With software I have access to, it's AI. There is no human error. It's really exciting.
Has there been evidence for people that have been exposed to mold, long-term exposure to mold and moisture?
Whew, yeah.
TBI?
That's probably more of a clinical correlation to make, but in an MRI setting, you're going to have to do probably a functional MRI to see how I've worked on toxicity cases before, mold, and yes, it's possible to show it in not axonal shearing, but inside the brain, we can see where possible toxicity is happening, but you're going to have to do a full-on functional MRI, and that's even more, involved.
Using studies also?
Yeah, there's definitely studies about that for sure. I can help you. I can point you in the right direction for that as well.
Dr. Barker, what would you do?
Yeah.
The mold cases are really tough, and because we have so much research on trauma. So we have research from trauma because we have veterans and we have so many accidents, and so the research is much more robust. So yeah. I think the mold stuff is harder, and there's for sure is research, because research on everything. But I think it'll be harder to find, and probably the clinical correlate will be pretty important.
Yeah.
What if the chronic use of certain medications over a period of time, where it could affect the brain?
So certainly chronic use of medications can affect the brain. Lots of things affect the brain, right? So people have strokes, people age, people have other injuries, and so that is just another thing that certainly can damage the brain. And again, you're going to clinically correlate. You're going to look at the patterns and the locations and the values, and then put that together with what the person was like before and after the injuries, and hopefully come up with the story. But certainly medications can affect the brain.
So if you're looking for an MRI facility, what are the minimum standards you should look for?
Only use Amelia. No, I'm kidding.
You are. You really are. Like, for example, the ones that we have calibrated to this software that I have access to is about a handful in California right now. We've got all northern covered to at least, a few hours out to get the patient there. But we have people coming out of state to just get this stuff. So we're continuing to put them on more MRIs, but without us, in general terms, I would ask if they have, obviously 3T is best, and then, if they have DTI capabilities, and then really it comes down to who's your neuroradiologist doing the findings. Are you dependent on the imaging center's neuroradiologist or radiologist most of the time? That's, get the general as much as you can, and then if you're continuing to work up that case and you're still seeing that, we could use more data, then let's get them in on another MRI, and that's not uncommon. I mean, we're scanning these patients multiple times on a case. So, let's go that route, if you will. So generally speaking, in order to just get the findings, I know it's hard out there without this type of software, but at least try and get the DTI portion of it. Volumetrics even over exonal sharing, I think. Volumetrics shows, I think, more in the TBI. I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. I guess it just depends.
Yeah, I would for sure try to have a 3 Tesla machine.
Yeah.
Like if you were going to order, it's a 3 Tesla machine.
Yeah.
And then I would say I like the SWI personally. I like that because the microbleeds is just so robust. Like for instance, microbleeds shouldn't happen from like aging or unless you have like some rare processes. But in general, like
you just said it. Sorry, SWI is not on every machine, so that would be a really good thing to ask.
Yeah, SWI, and then so I think those would be really good. Again, your DTIs are really good. Other things cause DTI problems, but we see patterns in traumatic brain injury. But I would say there's an order. But really, what. Excuse me for tooting my own horn, but what good is all that stuff if you don't have the right person ordering it and reviewing it, and clinically correlating it? So let's say your microbleeds come back positive or your DTI comes back positive. The defense is going to attribute that to something else, right? So that's probably what's going to happen. I do have cases. I have a case right now where the person at MRI had a really bad quality MRI, and it was a bad accident. This guy's clearly not well, and I'm pretty confident the higher magnet, even without all the fancy, just the 3, they got like a 1 Tesla or 1.5 Tesla. I'm sure just the 3 Tesla is probably going to show a ton of stuff, but the attorney didn't know. The attorney, they were like, oh, like it seems like it's really bad, but everything's normal, and I just like looked at it and I was like, oh, this is not a good MRI. They didn't even do any study to look for bleeding. That's like borderline like. I wouldn't to a place I wouldn't refer. Sometimes you're just stuck by where the patient is located, right? Or you just have to get what you have to get. But some things are just too below standard. So
I've also been on cases where the neurologist just automatically sends it to the imaging center because they've got a relationship or something, and so sometimes you don't get to interject that, right? But when you can, I would say highly try to see where these MRIs are being scheduled, just so you know, for your own, now that you know this knowledge, right? That's the biggest recommendation I can make, because I do see that a lot, and then by the time I get it, the imaging center is saying, oh, we've already scanned this patient because the neurologist sent it to us already. And I was like, oh, but they didn't get the right protocol, right? So there's some, obviously, loopholes here that we're trying to clean up, but as long as you know kind of what to look for, you can kind of interject that.
Any other questions? Oh, okay, awesome. Well, thank you guys for hanging in there for Friday afternoon, holiday weekend, I guess. And so I appreciate you guys. Just one more thanks to our sponsors, our headliner sponsor, All-in-One Lean, Santi Health Partners, and Catherine. Thank you guys so much. They, are the ones behind making all this happen. 3D Forensic, HMR, Walker Advertising, Gemini Legal Services, TBI Analytics, and my business development and marketing company, MCM. We have been working for a long time to make this all work together. So thank you guys for coming and making it everything that it is. And then save the date. This is part 1 of a 4-part series. And so June 28th will be our next installment, and this will be getting into TBI treatment, prognosis, rehab, building the case up. We're going to have a whole group of people talking about what that looks like, typical treatments, types of rehab, all of that stuff. Registration will open in May, and if you guys know of any sponsors that are interested in being a part of our presentation or our day, the sponsorships are open now. So I look forward to seeing you guys in June. I will not be moderating that one. I will be days away from having my baby. So if I'm here, that'll be awesome. But we will be hoping that I will be having my baby.
Right.
So thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you guys.
Thank you.